You're all very welcome this beautiful sunny evening to the glorious city of Armagh and to the Cardinal Librarian Archive. You're particularly welcome, I think, because I feared when I saw the forecast over the last week that most of you would be burning sausages in the back garden or too afraid to leave the house for fear of getting sunstroke, so thank you all for making the effort. I usually say that on a wet night when people make an effort to come out, but it's great to see people coming out tonight. I suppose this is an evening tinged with some sadness. It's obviously our memorial lecture. We did have an event last year to mark the first anniversary of Joe's passing. And Joe, of course, you will all know, was a stalwart of the Librarian Archive from its inception right through until, really just a few months, you might imagine, before he sadly passed away. And we still miss him greatly, but he's still here, as you can see, keeping an eye on us all, something which he does regularly, I think, anyway. But of course, today also marks the burial of Kevin McMahon. Kevin had a strong association not just with Armagh as a contributor to the journal, but also with the Creggan Historical Society, and was a real, I suppose, had a real encyclopedic knowledge of his home area and a great willingness to share that with others. So remembering both of them, I think, is important this evening. When I was preparing for tonight, I didn't realise that Ben started coming to this institution a few years before I started coming here, but I was pulling out a few exemplars to put on display on the little exhibit that we have outside, and I was preparing for this over the course of the last few days, and without meaning to be trite about this, I also learned then, sadly, on the news yesterday that someone else had passed away, and it was someone who I had gone in 1987 to see perform at Slane Castle, a guy called Christy Dignam. And for those of you who don't know who Christy is, go and look him up. If you do know who he was, nothing needs said. But in many ways, as a teenager heading off to one of my first concerts, I didn't begin to understand the importance of somewhere like Slane in terms of what we're going to be reflecting tonight. So when I was picking out a few items to put on display, one of the items that I discovered is a genealogy produced for a man called John Fleming, who could trace his lineage back to the 8th Baron of Slane. And he had this compiled in the early 18th century because he was getting married in Cadiz, and wanted, like the O'Donnells and the O'Neills, to gain some sense of recognition from the Spanish court for the title that he may well have had he remained in Ireland. I've only unrolled about 70 centimetres of it, because it's about 3.5 metres in length, and in spite of that, and in spite of this provable lineage, he didn't get a title from the Spanish court. So it wasn't all that easy to get those things. So it got me reflecting on the importance of the archive that we have here, and particularly the importance of what we're going to hear tonight from Ben. Not just was Tomas O'Fee instrumental in encouraging people, as those of you who were here for Neil Comer's lecture a few weeks ago, and encouraging people to learn about the language and history of their local area, but also he was aware of Ireland's and the Irish people's place within a wider European context, and how not just its intellectual class, but its clerical class, its business class, and so on, all had the measure of their peers across the continent. And I think for that reason, he happily embraced the work of Micheline Kerney Walsh. And of course, then eventually the Armagh would publish her great tome, Destruction by Peace, looking and focusing on Hugh O'Neill in the aftermath of his exit into Europe in the early 17th century. Damien has asked me to remind you that he has plenty of copies of this if you need a third or fourth. They're on sale at the bargain price of £20 outside. But he also has a range of other things, including a few off-prints from none other than tonight's speaker, because Ben isn't just a visitor to the Librarian archive here. Ben has actually come and worked on the Irish Overseas Archive. He completed his MA thesis on the archive itself, and it's outside in one of the display cabinets. But he has also been very much to the fore in promoting its use, encouraging people to use it. And in doing that, he has also contributed a number of articles to Common Seanchas and to the journal over the years. And again, there's a few of them available out beyond. But tonight is, I suppose, a two-pronged thing, it has dual purpose. One is to mark Joe and the contribution that he made to the Librarian archive here, but it's also part of our series this year to mark what would have been the 100th birthday of Cardinal O'Fee. This is the 5th in the series of spring lectures, and we hope to continue this on the other side of what promises to be a very balmy summer. So maybe in the more clement weather of the autumn, we can gather here again, and we'll begin the series again in September. So keep an eye out for our autumn series as well. But for tonight, I want to hand you over to a great friend of the library, a great scholar, and someone who I know will fill us full of wonder at what is the relationship between Cardinal O'Fee, Micheline Kerney Walsh, and the Irish Overseas Archive from 1954 to 1990. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roddy. I would like to begin by thanking Roddy for inviting me to give the following lecture. It is an honour to deliver this paper in memory of Joe Canning, whom I met here in Armagh in person 20 years ago this year. Joe was a great example, a quiet man of action who knew both Tomas O'Fee and Micheline Kerney Walsh. No account of the Irish Overseas Archive and its development could overlook the contribution made by Cardinal O'Fee and the Armagh Diocesan Historical Society. I would like to begin by drawing your attention to the following list of publications by Tomas O'Fee. This list is by no means exhaustive. So, for instance, the research and publications that Tomas O'Fee produced in relation to Cregan and the O'Neills of the Fuse, that is elsewhere. But I have a purpose for showing you this. Tomas O'Fee understood the depth and breadth of history in the long term. All time is a succession. Before the religious changes of the 16th century, Irish people were already well connected with continental networks, and they maintained institutions overseas. For example, O'Fee brought the Ulster Earls' arrival on the continent before a wide public, but his writings also created an awareness of much earlier Irish activities. To illustrate this further, in the early 17th century, Irish Franciscans visited foundations established in the Middle Ages by their predecessors from Ireland. Finally, on this point, in 1669, many of the places on St. Oliver Plunkett's itinerary were familiar to Irish clergymen since the time of Columbanus. We know this again from the Irish Franciscans, those based in Leuven. It is therefore appropriate that the Irish Overseas Archive found its home here at the Cardinal O'Fee Memorial Library and Archive. This paper takes account of correspondence between Micheline Kerney Walsh and the Cumann before giving details of Overseas Archive publications. We are fortunate, for our purposes, to have relevant sources preserved in the Cardinal Librarian archive to locate the Overseas Archive in its particular context. In early 20th century Ireland, manuscript materials were recognised as a source of prestige. After the fire that destroyed the Public Record Office in Dublin in 1922, demands for the regeneration of historical records grew. Historians and researchers were motivated by a strong desire to investigate, reconstruct, and bring together sources about Irish individuals and families preserved in repositories abroad. There were, according to Richard J. Hayes, Director of the National Library of Ireland, more records relating to Irish history outside of Ireland than in the country. And this was even the case before the Public Record Office was destroyed. The Irish Overseas Archive was founded in 1954 by Professor Patrick McBride of University College Dublin. Its aim to record the early modern history of the Irish in continental Europe, amounting to more than 200,000 documents. Just to let that sink in, 200,000 documents. The Overseas Archive was housed at University College Dublin prior to its acquisition by the Cardinal Tomas Memorial Library and Archive in 1999. The contents comprise copies of state records, letters, memoirs, diaries, business and legal transactions, certificates of nobility, military and naval records, wills, professional and academic distinctions, parish and diocesan records. The documents relate to various categories of people, including the clergy, soldiers and merchants, and the administrative bodies that dealt with them abroad. Above all, the central focus is family history research. Professor McBride defined the archive's criteria for selection. These were to make available unpublished sources on the part played by Irish men and women in the history and development of European countries since they began to settle on the continent in post-Reformation times. McBride made contact with the descendants of Irish families abroad, obtaining permission to microfilm their manuscripts. The value of archival material from abroad was, he said, enhanced by the fact that our native documentation is meagre by comparison with that of other European countries. Within 3 years of opening, McBride reported that 30,000 feet of microfilm had been collected. 30,000 feet. Staff in Dublin benefited from the time and money saved by completing their research in Ireland. And according to the Irish press, a most remarkable body of archives and family documents was being methodically gathered, and an extraordinary amount of new information dealing with Irish activities abroad was being accumulated, which when published in a series of volumes would astonish. In the 50-year period after 1922, neither the National Archives of Ireland nor local authority archives existed. As was the case in North America, therefore, the collection of records was left to the initiative of individual enthusiasts beyond central government control. At the time, according to newspaper reports, historians were expected to be solemn, owl-like men, eyes blinking through spectacles. Exceptionally, from the start, the foremost contributor to the Overseas Archive was Micheline Kerney Walsh, who joined as assistant director. One of her first tasks was to prepare work for the Irish Manuscripts Commission, gathering sources in France, Italy, Spain and Portugal. Micheline was born in Paris in 1919. In that year, her father, Leopold Kerney, was appointed Irish trade representative in Paris. 16 years later, he became Ireland's first minister plenipotentiary to Spain. In a speech prepared by the Department of External Affairs in Dublin, Leopold Kerney emphasised the historic links between the two countries, that is, Ireland and Spain. The Taoiseach and Minister for External Affairs, Eamon de Valera, had a direct interest in tracing his Spanish ancestry. He instructed Kerney to investigate the historical sources in Spain during his diplomatic posting. The earliest papers in the Overseas Archive date from this time. Micheline attended school in Kildare, Paris, Madrid and Dublin. By the age of 13, she had passed the formal written test to show her fluency in the Irish language and gained the fáinne. From 1938 to 41, Micheline studied French and Spanish at UCD, where she was elected president of the French Society. On the 7th of November 1941, she was conferred with the B.A. and married Richard B. Walsh, that's Richard Brannock. According to newspaper reports from the time, the wedding was attended by Eamon de Valera, members of the government, the diplomatic corps, government officials, professional and businessmen. So you can see the prominence that Micheline gained as well within this period, because that's a photograph from a newspaper when she was a child, and we have another photograph then from her time in UCD as a student. The majority of materials at the Overseas Archive were obtained from primary sources located at the Archivo General de Simancas in Spain. 8 or 9 graduates were employed each year with a rush to fill any vacant place. For the staff, fluency in languages was the first essential in order to transcribe into typescript handwriting, often crabbed and dating back centuries. Micheline Kerney Walsh stated that all transcripts and references made were put through triple checking with the original documents or photocopies. A card catalogue was prepared to arrange the documents and serve as a guide to staff members. Each stage of the research was compiled on a seasonal basis. During the summer, staff visited libraries and archives overseas with lists of possible sources of information. They emerged with documents painstakingly copied by hand before returning to Dublin to complete their findings during the autumn and winter. For the first year of its existence, the Overseas Archive was kept in a room on the top floor of the university building in Earlsfort Terrace. During the summer of 1955, the collection of transcripts and microfilm was moved to larger premises in Merville on Foster's Avenue. That's next to the present campus. This had previously been occupied by a manor house and stables. In 1958, the archive was moved again, this time to Belgrove, a detached house on the Stillorgan Road that it shared with the Laboratory of Logic and Psychology. During this time, significantly, Father Tomas made regular research visits. So these are photos to show you directly. That's the archive at work in this period. On the left, you can see actually Micheline is working with microfilm there. One of the remarkable strengths of the Irish Overseas Archive was its ability to keep itself in the public eye. Much depended upon adequate funding. Staff were supported in part by teaching Italian and Spanish at UCD. Under the auspices of the university and interest groups, Patrick McBride gave public lectures promoting awareness of Ireland's links with the continent and of the work undertaken by the archive. In the context of increased emigration from Ireland during the 1950s, the Overseas Archive described the history of Irish emigration as a predominantly Catholic experience of both exile and opportunity. It was at this time that an American publication described the archive at Belgrove as a rescue operation to search for material relating to the Irish in the 16th to the 18th century. A wealth of material of genealogical significance found there is preserved in microfilm. In 1957, Professor McBride read the first O'Donnell lecture on the subject of the O'Neills in Spain. The research for the paper was compiled by Micheline Kerney Walsh, who published it as a separate study. Described by the historian Dennis Cregan as elegantly produced, the O'Neills in Spain consisted of detailed notes on 16 members of the family who made their home in Spain. The first volume of Spanish Knights of Irish Origin, Documents from Continental Archives, as shown in the slide, appeared in 1960, with Micheline Walsh as consulting editor. This formed part of the Irish Manuscripts Commission publication programme of continental primary sources. Editorial work by the Overseas Archive provided manuscript calendars for the widely dispersed testimonies that recommended Irish applicants for ennoblement on the continent from the 17th to the 19th centuries. The findings from more than 20 archives showed that there were nearly 200 knights of Irish origin in the 5 Spanish military orders. Tomas described the contents as splendid and eagerly awaited each instalment. He praised the thoroughness of the indexes and offered congratulations on behalf of the Common, adding the hope that further publications will not be too long delayed. In a detailed review of the absorbing third volume of Spanish Knights of Irish Origin, O'Fee commended the invaluable research that led to a wealth of new sources on the Irish in Spain, and he identified topics for further investigation. Here he cited preparations for a biographical dictionary of the Irish in Spain, but this was not to materialise. So, moving now to initial contact with the Common. Archivists in 20th century Ireland recognised new historical societies as a most potent means to promote culture and heritage. To bring its research to local communities throughout the country, the Overseas Archive worked collaboratively with scholars and collectors to publish copies of newly discovered sources. Above all, 2 societies were involved in providing access to the findings made by the Overseas Archive. These were Cumann Seanchas Ar Mhacha and the Military History Society of Ireland. Written, printed and photographic material about numerous talks and publications confirm its involvement with many other groups. The focus of attention noticeably concentrated on Ulster and the Archdiocese of Armagh. You can see that really from the list, but I have a map here as well. So this is the distribution, geographically, of journals and periodicals which published material from the Overseas Archive while it was still based in Dublin. Whereas archivists and historians in other countries were sent abroad by their governments to compile documentation, Overseas Archive staff conducted their work more informally. Consequently, the commensurate growth of historical societies meant that the archive developed in line with the historical manuscripts tradition and the influence of librarianship, more so than the public archives concept and the principle of provenance. The Military History Society of Ireland was established in 1949. Among its founding members were Richard G.A.A., mentioned earlier, and Gerard Hayes McCoy, who served as founding editor of the Society's journal, The Irish Sword. The Overseas Archive began publishing in its pages within a year of opening, and from 1957 to 1970, Micheline Kerney Walsh compiled a series of 10 articles from newly discovered documents relating to Hugh O'Neill. Tomas O'Fee regarded these as the most important contribution of local interest at that time, adding that the research provided an antidote to earlier sources of information. The story of the O'Neills was a major theme of Tomas O'Fee's work as author. It is quite likely that he and Patrick McBride met at UCD. This is during Tomas O'Fee's studies in Dublin. They shared a nationalist perspective in their political views. Father O'Fee completed postgraduate studies in early and medieval Irish history at UCD from 1947 to 1950, graduating MA with first-class honours. At that time, a significant number of priests worked on the teaching staff at UCD, while many seminarians and religious sisters made up the classes. Conversant in German and French, O'Fee's interest in the Irish historical presence on the continent began at Louvain in the early 1950s. From Professor of Modern History and President of Maynooth to Archbishop of Armagh and Cardinal, the terms of address in letters from Tomas O'Fee and the Overseas Archive accurately reflect the direction of his career. From his student days at Louvain, Tomas O'Fee travelled widely and took a keen interest in the many surviving reminders of Irish activity on the continent. Significantly, it seems, it was Father O'Fee who initiated contact between the Common and the Overseas Archive. He wrote to Patrick McBride on the 24th of May, 1955. That's just a year after its foundation. And he requested permission to consult any relevant sources about the family of Owen Roe O'Neill and the earldom of Tyrone from 1650 to 1670. And he also inquired about the possibility of arranging a meeting with McBride. Father O'Fee also asked a question on behalf of Dr. Austin Quinn, Bishop of Kilmore. It is as follows, I'll read it to you. A family tradition which has down to the present day that Lieutenant General Felix O'Neill brought out 2 young nephews named O'Toole to Spain and secured commissions for them in the Spanish Army. And when the initiative of Professor Patrick McBride of University College Dublin brought Spanish military records to Dublin on microfilm, it was rewarding to discover that this tradition was substantially correct. For an editor and historian, one can imagine the potential benefits of finding original source material and new contributors for the journal. As a central figure in the Common, Tomas Sophie's communication with the Overseas Archive also offered the possibility of speakers who could give talks to the Society. The Overseas Archive was increasingly recognised for its intermediary role between continental repositories and interest groups in Ireland, thereby gaining a new opportunity to promote its activity at events and publish authoritative research. So there we have it. There's Felix O'Neill, as described just now, and there's the description of the family tradition as provided by Tomas Sophie. Proven by the manuscripts, which are actually here, to be substantially correct. So keeping in mind the idea of inviting speakers, and we're looking now at 1960 for Micheline Kerney Walsh, then in that year, Micheline addressed Cumann Seancha Sardwaka at the AGM of that year. Her letter of acceptance stated, "I feel that my loyalty to the O'Neills, including even those of Cregan, demands my presence at the Armagh Diocesan Historical Society. The journey from Armagh took about 2.5 hours. Father Lafree advised her that leaving Dublin at 3, you could be in Armagh in time for tea." The Irish Independent reported that an important and enthusiastic audience attended the event in St Patrick's Hall, Armagh. Cardinal Dalton, patron of the Society, sent his blessing to the members and his prayer that their work would have success in the coming year. Tomas Sophie noted that Mrs. Walsh put us deeply in her debt by her memorable lecture to our Society. So again, it's Cardinal Dalton who gave his blessing to that particular meeting, and a contemporary photograph of the city of Armagh in that decade. In 1974, Tomas Sophie invited Kerney Walsh to lecture on her research, and he told her the following: "Don't worry about the troubles. We'll look after you well, please God. They seem much worse to a person in Dublin than one in Armagh." That's from a letter that Tomas Sophie wrote to Micheline. Afterwards, Micheline described the visit as an enjoyable expedition out of the Pale, and she saw many places of interest. The crowning glory of the places of interest that she saw, she recorded, being the wonderful view from Slieve Gullion. Thereafter, regular references to the comparatively dull surroundings of the Pale occur in letters to the Committee of Uncommon. The lecture that year, that is 1974, it took place in the Sacred Heart Convent in Armagh. They have a fine hall, Father Ray Murray noted. The grounds are private, so it is completely safe and suitable. On Wednesday, the 16th of October, despite a wet night, about 200 people gathered to hear Micheline Kerney Walsh. Her paper explained how and why countless numbers of the O'Neills were exiled throughout the world in early modern times. Afterwards, she wrote to express her thanks, quote, "To the Society for the opportunity of another memorable visit to O'Neill's country. With Patrick and Malachy as patrons, no wonder the people of Armagh are so special." In an interview that year with the Irish press, Micheline Kerney Walsh described the enormous continental hinterland of Irish history that scholars had not drawn upon in any depth, and maintained these sources needed to be properly explored. The results of continental research added an international perspective to the writing of Irish history and addressed errors of omission. 10 members of Overseas Archive staff edited historical documents for publication. Many readers would have been unable to refer to the original material due to the distance involved in travelling between repositories and the difficulty of communicating in different languages. These contributions helped to ensure a balance in the internal and external history of Ireland. Searching in the municipal archives of Bilbao, Anne Moran found previously unpublished material of Irish historical interest. Among these papers were sworn affidavits and a genealogy presented by Christopher Plunkett in 1683 that shed further light on the Plunkett family as a whole. It stated that he was a son of Patrick Plunkett, one of St. Ulva Plunkett's older brothers. This was part of a series in Seanachas Ardwaka about Oliver of Armagh and the campaign for his canonisation in the 1950s. In being a young woman, Anne Moran was a notable exception among the contributors. Together, their meticulous approach illustrates the application of the critical method to historical work and how this enabled record societies to collect and publish archival material. After an initial foray into archival sources for ecclesiastical history, Patrick McBride and his staff became better known for their coverage of military history. This may be explained by the fact that Catholic historical writing in Ireland was generously supplied with historians from religious orders with a long and rich tradition of record keeping, such as the Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits. Micheline Kerney Walsh lectured to and published for the Society for more than 4 decades, with 14 contributions to Seanachas, far outnumbering her publications in other journals. The well-coordinated selection of material for the Society shows clear signs of Tomas O'Fee's influence and consistently reflected his research interests. These included the history of Ulster families, and Micheline Kerney Walsh wrote a series of articles about the O'Neills, this great diocesan family. That's how it's termed in the document. Building up to the publication of a biography of Hugh O'Neill. The other subjects included the Irish colleges in France and Spain, and the history of the Archdiocese of Armagh from the 16th to the 18th centuries. In other respects, this echoes the consideration and foresight that Tomas Sophie's contemporaries noted in his character. Assembled from archives in Belgium, France, Mexico, Rome, and Spain, the contents of these scholarly writings were not limited to Ulster. Examples include new documents from Simancas about a 16th century military order dedicated to St. Patrick. This recounted how a Limerick man, John de Lacy, made his way from Scotland to Spain and Portugal via Denmark and the Low Countries. Following the appointment of Tomas Sophie as Archbishop of Armagh, Father Patrick Campbell succeeded to the editorship of Seanachas Ardwacha. Father Campbell often recorded his gratitude for Micheline Kerney Walsh's contributions, describing her as, quote, one of the great pillars of the journal, unquote. In June 1978, he acknowledged her, again a direct quote, her customary exactness, clarity and scholarship, unquote. As a mark of appreciation the following year, the Common organised a visit for Micheline Kerney Walsh to Benburb, Armagh and Dungannon. In 1985, Father Ray Murray's first edition of Seanachas, volume 11 of the journal, was dedicated to Micheline Kerney Walsh in recognition of her outstanding contribution to Irish source history. On the 2nd of December 1981, a subcommittee was appointed to consider publishing more of Micheline Kerney Walsh's work on the O'Neills. Perhaps the most significant success for the Overseas Archive was the publication of Destruction by Peace, Hugh O'Neill After Kinsale. That is the book referred to by Roddy earlier, and you can buy your copy from Damien. Published by the Common, the book was dedicated to the Dean and published by Paddy Smith and R&S Printers of Monaghan. Matters got off to an auspicious start. Cardinal O'Fee agreed to write the preface to the book and financial backing was secured. According to Father Campbell, the source of funding was very appropriately from a Tyrone O'Neill, namely Pat O'Neill of Donamore. Father Campbell and Father Murray provided considerable help in the final months by checking bundles of page proofs for the book. At the launch in Dungannon, seat of the O'Neills, on the 19th of June 1986, Cardinal O'Fee and Father Campbell paid tribute to Micheline Kerney Walsh's unique understanding of her subject. 1,000 copies were produced. On the 12th of August 1986, Micheline noted that the average time it takes to sell 1,000 copies is 18 months. So we might as well be patient. It is noticeable how much has changed since the arrival of the internet and the influence exerted by online book sales. Because from 1986 to 1991, publications manager Paddy Hamill attended to orders for Destruction by Peace from shops throughout Ireland. Further afield, he made arrangements with distributors in North America. In 1986, the House of Commons ordered a copy. Many people helped with the distribution of copies. Committee members and their children made deliveries to shops, including O'Gorman's and Kenny's in Galway. Father Campbell accounted for sales of more than 100 copies of the book. In many ways, retirement helped Micheline Kerney Walsh to concentrate more upon her research and writing. The best illustration of this point is her book of 1986. Micheline retired from UCD that year. Astute in recovering payments from booksellers, she availed of her free travel pass as a senior citizen to promote the book on day trips to Cork and Limerick. And she noted, to my great satisfaction, it worked on the trains as well as on the buses. Much more restful than driving, and not to mention cheaper. Sales of the book were helped by reviews in the Linen Hall Review, probably the most influential in the North, where Tom Bartlett warmly congratulated Armagh Historical Society on their enterprise in publishing such a handsome volume. In October 1986, Micheline noted that the Irish Literary Supplement very properly praised the production of the book. At the end of the following year, Irish Historical Studies also gave good and due praise to the Society. Little wonder then that Micheline referred to this work as our book. An abridged paperback edition, An Exile of Ireland, Hugh O'Neill, Prince of Ulster, was published in Dublin in 1996, and to mark the 4th centenary of Hugh O'Neill's death, the Cumann reprinted Destruction by Peace in 2016. On the 3rd of October 1989, Micheline Kerney Walsh acknowledged the sponsorship provided by the Society and recorded that all costs towards the publication of Destruction by Peace had been met. It was a great joy for her to have this matter successfully concluded and to note the wide distribution of the book and its general acceptance. The committee of Cumann recorded that her own part in its distribution was a very big factor in the success of this operation. On various historical excursions at home and abroad, Micheline accompanied the Society as lecturer, during which they visited places with Irish connections over the centuries. So I'm sure that many of you recognise people in that photo. And we can see actually that Micheline is there towards the centre. There's Paddy Campbell on the left side of the photo. There's the Dean. In 1994, 32 members of the Cumann made a pilgrimage to northern Spain. And 12 years later, Joe Canning organised a further tour of Spain with visits to Salamanca, Valladolid, and the Spanish State Archives at Simancas Castle. That's the archives there. And there is a direct connection between Simancas and Armagh, with the Overseas Archive, because so much of what is the Overseas Archive is from Simancas. After taking part in a tour of Brittany, Micheline prepared for print some Irish historical links with Brittany in the 16th and 17th centuries. The text was published posthumously in Shanachas. To give you a little bit of background on the arrival of the Overseas Archive in Armagh, when it changed to the rules of the Society in 1991 allowed more than one patron of the Society, Dr. Micheline Kerney Walsh was honoured to become a patron. In her capacity as a member of the Trust, she advised on standards required for the storage and exhibition of archival documents. In addition, she obtained support from the Irish ambassadors to Paris and to Madrid. Both endorsed plans for a purpose-built library and archive to commemorate the life and work of Tomas O'Fee. With Cumann Seanachas Ardwaka, Micheline Kerney Walsh found a knowledgeable and appreciative audience, well attuned to her research. Through the study of history and culture in an international context, Tomas O'Fee and his contemporaries were responsible for much of the forward planning and preparations that led to the acquisition of the Irish Overseas Archive. After 5 decades exploring the history and heritage of the Irish overseas, Micheline Kerney Walsh found a home for the work she organised with her colleagues as part of the extensive collections of the Cardinal O'Fee Library and Archive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm sure you'd be happy to take a question or two.
Yes.
Yes? If anybody has anything they'd like to address from that wonderful journey through 2 lives interconnected there by the archive itself. If I just could pick up on something you had mentioned there earlier on about how it's fundamentally a family history archive, it has great genealogical potential. Just a reflection on part of the contribution that Joe made to the library here was to collect periodicals, and he had done the same in his previous role in the Local Studies Library in Armagh, and it's interesting to see that in some of those contemporary journalism from the 1940s and 50s and so on, that there is a reflection of that sort of the importance of continental archives or that connection with the continent. Just recently I was looking at a copy of Celtica, which begins in the mid-1940s, and Father Kenneth Mooney had a wonderful article in it which has nothing whatsoever to do with family history, but it's embedded in that tradition of the, as you said at the outset, there was more overseas than there was at home, and it's an article which I think is still being used right down to the present day by place name scholars, because it collected, it was a Friar Paul O'Gormley who had collected material to send off to Leuven, and it was basically a study of various place names across, I think, 2 or 3 different counties, and these fragments then were being rediscovered in the 1940s and published in a journal like that. So, as I say, I think it demonstrates the importance of that element of our archival record isn't just here, that there's so much continental based as well.
Definitely, and I mean, when you say that, you remind me of the whole principle of nomenclature, which historians in early centuries associated with family name and the place name, and they always maintained that it was essential to preserve both, to record both. And this is something that you find in Leuven a lot with the Irish Franciscans in Leuven, that they're insisting on that historical principle of nomenclature.
Yes.
What were the pleasant things for you to discover in this research this time that really stood out for you?
Really, it's a privilege to work on this archive because it deserves so much more attention, really. And it's a succession of discoveries that you can make when you have the time and the space to explore something, you know, and when you have the privilege of looking at it. Because, you know, I think the best insight that I obtained was through the letters from Tomas to the Overseas Archive, his correspondence with Patrick McBride, the letters that Micheline Kerney Walsh wrote as well, you know, in relation to the visits that she made and the papers that she gave. And I mean, I think it's fair to say as well that you get an excellent insight into Tomas' sense of humour. For the things that he said, the two examples I gave you, you know, if you leave a tree, you'll be here in time for tea. And don't worry about the troubles, you know, which I think is a reflection of his personality, his character, and his sense of humour. So, something else that, you know, this in many ways, when you consider the history for this paper begins in 1954, so much of this for people is still a recollection. It's still current, it's something that you can still remember. And that makes it significant too, because I began this work during what is termed the decade of the revolution. And that being a time when our own families, from 1919 to 23, from 1919 to 23, and 1916, 1913 to 23. But this is more immediate still because it begins in the 50s. But we can place Micheline Kerney Walsh in that context as well because of her father. And her father was trade consul in Paris and was then based in Madrid as the first Irish plenipotentiary. So it's full of discovery, and again, in all sincerity, it is a privilege to examine the contents. I'd love to be able to, I've always said this to Roddy, that, and I used to say it to Joe as well, I would love to be able to bring it to greater prominence. As I mentioned to you earlier on, Don, I'd really like to see the archive catalogued and for people to have a true appreciation of what's there, because it's like, you know, it's like an iceberg. I know that's a cliche, but it is like an iceberg in that what the majority of people know of it bears no relation to the actual reality of what is there. It's incredible. And all of the work has been done already. All of the work was assembled by a team of people from 1954 right through to the death of Micheline Kerney Walsh in 1997. It's a treasure. It is a true treasure.